The cold that settled over Harlan County, Kentucky, in January of 1955 had a particular quality to it. Not the clean bite of high country winter, but something heavier, something that pressed through wool and found the skin beneath. It smelled of coal dust and frozen mud, of chimney smoke that hung too low to clear the ridge lines, of creosote from railroad ties laid down a generation ago and left to rot in the damp. The kind of cold that did not shock you when you stepped outside, but waited instead, patient and thorough, until it had worked its way through every layer you owned, and then kept working. In the coal towns strung along the Cumberland River that year, people did not speak of winter as something that came and went. They spoke of it as something they endured. Harlan County in the winter of 1955 was a place of diminishing things. The big seams were thinning. The companies that had come in the 1920s and built the company towns and the company stores and the company churches were sending fewer men into the ground each year. Not because the coal was gone, but because the machines were coming, continuous miners that could do in an hour what a crew of 12 did in a shift. The union had won wages and safety rules and portal-to-portal pay, but it could not win back the jobs the machines were taking. And so the population of towns like Benham and Lynch and Loyal was bleeding off quietly, a family at a time, to Cincinnati and Detroit and Dayton, where the auto plants were hiring. The ones who stayed were the ones who could not yet leave, or would not, or had already put too many years into the mountain to walk away from what it owed them. The county seat itself, the town of Harlan, sat at the confluence of Clover Fork and Poor Fork and the main stem of the Cumberland, ringed by ridges that kept the light short even on clear days. In January, the sun cleared the eastern ridge by 9:30 in the morning and was behind the western ridge by 3 in the afternoon, leaving 5.5 hours of gray useful light. The town had 4,000 people, a courthouse that had seen more violence than most, a railroad depot that handled both passengers and coal, 2 banks, a hardware store, 3 churches on a main street, and a diner called Tatum's that opened at 5 in the morning for the miners coming off the night shift. The county had a history of hard dealing, strikes and lockouts and men with guns on both sides, and it had left a residue in the way people moved through the world there cautious and watchful, with the instinct to trust earned rather than given. It was into this place, in the first week of January, that the facts of Clara Hodges' situation became fully visible, though they had been forming for the better part of a year. Clara Hodge lived 3 miles out from the Harlan Courthouse on the Baxter Road, in a white frame house with a porch along the front and a fence line along the road made of split locust posts and 5 strands of wire. The fence was her late husband's work, put up one August weekend 6 years ago when Robert Hodge still had 2 good hands and thought he had time. By January of 1955, 2 of the posts had healed over and the wire sagged between them, and Clara had not yet found a Saturday dry enough and light enough to fix it. That fence was the first thing a person saw coming up the Baxter Road toward her property. It was in its way the first word of her story, slightly diminished but still standing. Clara Hodge was 38 years old in January of 1955. She had been born Clara Vance in Bell County, the second of 4 children of man who had worked timber before the big companies stripped the ridges and left nothing worth cutting. Her family had moved to Harlan County when she was 9, her father finding work at the Benham mine, and she had gone to school in a mining camp and then to the county high school in Harlan proper, where she had been a good student, better than good, her teachers said, in arithmetic and in geography, subjects that dealt in measurement and fact. She had married Robert Hodge at 19 in the spring of 1936, which was not the best year to be starting out in Harlan County, but was the year things came together for them, and they had made do. Robert had been a timberman in the mines. Not a miner himself, but the man who cut and set the wooden props that held the roof above the working faces. It was skilled work that paid better than loading and was considered safer than cutting coal at the seam, though no work underground was safe. He had kept the job through the Depression and through the war years when production ran around the clock, and by 1948 he had saved enough, combined with a small inheritance from his father, to buy the house and 40 acres on the Baxter Road from the estate of a man named Clifton Combs who had died without heirs. The deed was recorded in the Harlan County Courthouse on March 12, 1948, for the sum of $2,800, and Robert Hodge signed it in the good hand of a man who understood that he had just bought the firmest ground he would ever stand on. They had 3 children. Ruth was born in 1937, 17 years old now, and finishing her last year of high school. Thomas came in 1940, 14, and working weekends and summers at the Tatum Hardware store on Main Street. Not the diner, but the hardware, sweeping and stacking and learning the names of things. The youngest was a girl named Patsy, 9 years old, small for her age, and given to spending hours at the kitchen table drawing horses in the margins of her school books, which Clara discouraged but not seriously. What the Hodge land produced, or tried to produce, was a working combination. There were 8 acres of bottomland along the creek that ran the south edge of the property, rich enough for a kitchen garden expanded to something near commercial scale. Clara sold vegetables to 3 restaurants in Harlan, and to whoever stopped at the farm stand she put out by the road from June through October. There were 20 acres of pasture, fenced separately from the road fence, where she ran 11 head of beef cattle and 4 dairy cows. And there was a stand of timber on the back 12 acres that she had not touched, partly because the market was soft and partly because she thought of it as something to keep until it was genuinely needed. The cattle were her main income now. She sold 2 or 3 animals a year to the Harlan packing house and sold milk and butter locally through an informal arrangement with 2 families on the road who paid her in cash at the start of each month. It was not a large operation, but it was hers, and it had been Robert's. And before the accident at the mine, it had been on its way to becoming something she could hand down. Robert Hodge had been hurt in October of 1951. A roof fall on the 3rd left entry of the Clossplint mine, a place where he had worked for years, where he knew every timber he had set, caught him during a shift that should have been ordinary. The roof came down 6 feet behind the active face, where he was adjusting a prop that had begun to lean, and it took 2 of his fingers on the right hand and cracked 3 ribs and did something to his lower back that the doctors at the Harlan Hospital described carefully and then declined to predict an outcome for. He lived, which was the first and most important thing. He came home in November of that year and spent the winter in the house, moving carefully, healing at the rate the doctors had hoped for in the optimistic version of their projections. But he never went back underground. A man who sets timber needs both hands and a back that will answer when he calls on it, and Robert Hodge's back did not fully answer again. He found work above ground, at the mine office, keeping records for 8 months, but the company closed that surface operation in the spring of 1953 when they consolidated administrative work to the Benham office, and Robert was let go with a handshake and 60 days of severance. He spent the summer of 1953 doing what he could on the farm, and Clara ran the cattle and the garden and sold enough to carry them through. But his health was not improving. By the autumn of 1953, it was clear that it was going to require more doctoring than they had budgeted for, and Clara began to use the savings account at the Harlan National Bank for purposes it had not been opened for. Robert Hodge died of a cardiac event on February 14, 1954. He was 42 years old. His heart, the doctor said, had been under strain. The injury, the months of limited activity, the weight of a man whose body had been built for hard work and was no longer permitted to do it. He died in the house, in the bedroom, with Clara beside him and the 3 children down the hall. Ruth had known something was wrong. Thomas had not. Patsy had been asleep. The funeral cost $340, paid from a savings account, which by that point held $412. Clara made the arrangements herself at Combs Funeral Home on the south end of Main Street, and she paid in full on the day of the service because that was how she had been raised to do it. What was left in the savings account afterward was $72. The mortgage on the Baxter Road property had been taken in 1948 from the Harlan National Bank. Not a purchase mortgage, since Robert had paid cash for the land, but a subsequent improvement loan taken in 1949 for the sum of $1,800, used to build the hay barn and fence the pasture and install a hand pump on the well. The loan had been signed at an interest rate of 5.5% over 15 years, with monthly payments of $15.42. For 4 years, they had made every payment on the first of the month, sometimes early. The payment book, a small cardboard-covered ledger with the bank's name on the cover, sat in the kitchen drawer and showed 48 consecutive entries in Robert's handwriting. The first entry in Clara's handwriting was April 1954. It was 3 weeks late. By June of 1954, she was 60 days behind. By September, she was 90 days behind, and the bank had sent 2 letters, both addressed to the estate of Robert M. Hodge. The third letter, dated November 3, 1954, was addressed to Clara Hodge directly, and it was written by a man named Aldous Fitch, who held the title of Assistant Manager for Loan Recovery at the Harlan National Bank. The letter stated that the outstanding balance of the improvement loan stood at $1,044, that the account was in arrears by $416, representing 27 missed or partial payments, and that the bank was compelled by its obligations to its depositors to initiate foreclosure proceedings against the property described in the original deed of trust if the arrearage was not satisfied within 60 days of the date of the letter. January 3rd, 1955. That was the deadline. That was the number. $416 by January 3rd, or the Harlan National Bank would begin the legal process of taking the Baxter Road property. Aldous Fitch had been at the Harlan National Bank for 11 years. He was not a cruel man in the way that word is usually meant. He was a man who worked inside a system that had its own logic, its own pressures, its own requirement to show regulators and shareholders that delinquent accounts were being managed. He had a ledger on his desk that showed 42 delinquent loans, of which Clara Hodges was neither the largest nor the smallest. He had procedures that told him what letters to send and when, and he sent them on schedule. He had a supervisor, a man named Gerald Poole, who was the bank president and who sat on the county hospital board and the school board and who attended the First Baptist Church on Sunday mornings, who reviewed the delinquency report at the start of each month and asked Fitch where things stood. Fitch told him where things stood. Poole was not a corrupt man either, not in the sense of taking money for favors. He was a man who had decided, sometime in the middle of his career, that the rules were the rules and that bending them for one person required bending them for everyone, and that this was not something a sound institution could afford. He was correct about this in the abstract. He was also correct that the Hodge account was not large. And he was not incorrect when he said to Fitch in October of 1954 that the bank had already demonstrated patience with the estate and that January was a reasonable deadline. Clara had tried everything inside reach. In September, she had gone to see a cousin of Robert's, a man named Dewey Hodge, who ran a salvage yard on the other side of the ridge and was rumored to have money. Dewey had listened carefully and said he wished he could help and explained that his own situation was not what people assumed. He was not lying. She could see it in his yard, the way things were stacked but not sold, and she did not press him. In October, she had gone to the courthouse to ask about the widow's pension through the state, which a neighbor had told her about. A woman at the clerk's counter had looked up the relevant statute and found that the pension applied to widows of men who had died in certain certified occupations listed in a 1947 amendment, and that a man who had been injured underground but had subsequently been employed above ground and who had died of a cardiac event at home did not qualify under the language as written. The woman said this in a measured voice and with genuine regret, and she gave Clara the name of a lawyer who handled these matters. The lawyer's consultation fee was $35, which Clara did not have. She thanked the woman and left. In November, she had taken a part-time job at the diner, not Tatum's on the main street, but a smaller place on the road toward Cumberland called the Ridgeline, where she worked Tuesday and Thursday evenings and all day Saturday. The pay was 60 cents an hour plus whatever tips came her way, which in a diner serving miners and truckers on a county road outside a small city was not a great deal. In the 6 weeks she worked before Christmas, she earned $38 and kept most of it. Ruth watched Patsy on those evenings, and Thomas was old enough to manage the cattle chores on mornings when his mother had worked the night before. The children did this without complaint, which Clara noticed and did not say enough about. In December, she had gone to the bank itself and asked to speak with Aldous Fitch. She had sat in the chair across from his desk, in her good coat, the one she kept for church, and she had explained the situation in plain terms, not asking for mercy, exactly, but asking for the logic of it. The arrearage was $416. The land itself, the 40 acres with the house and barn and timber, was worth considerably more than the outstanding balance of the loan. Foreclosing would cost the bank legal fees and the trouble of a sale, and it would get them, on the best day, perhaps $12 or $15 above what she owed. She asked whether there was a path to extending the repayment schedule or deferring the arrearage to the back end of the loan term, which she had read about in a pamphlet she had gotten at the courthouse. Fitch had listened to all of this. He was polite. He was, in his way, sympathetic. He told her that the deferral program she had read about was a federal program that had applied to wartime loans under a specific New Deal statute that had since been allowed to lapse, and that the Harlan National Bank did not offer a comparable product. He told her that the loan terms were what they were. He told her he was sorry for her loss, and he meant it. He told her that the deadline was January 3rd and that the amount was $416. She went home on that December afternoon and sat in the kitchen for a long time before she started supper. By Christmas, she had managed to save, between the diner earnings and the cattle sales and what remained of the garden money, $211. She was $205 short with 8 days left in December and 8 days into January before the bank acted. She worked every shift the Ridgeline would give her, and she sold 2 jars of butter and a side of winter vegetables to the Harlan Hotel restaurant, and she sold one of the dairy cows, the oldest one, to a farmer named Combs on the far side of the ridge for $30, which was not what the cow was worth, but was what the man would pay in January. On the last day of December, she sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and counted what she had. $278. Still $138 short. She did not know where $138 was going to come from. John Wayne came into Harlan County in the first days of January 1955 without announcement. He was not there on any particular piece of business that the town knew about, not filming, not attending any event of public record, not passing through on a route that required Harlan as a stop. He had been in southeastern Kentucky the previous week on a matter of private business involving a timber operation in which he held a partial interest through a land company he ran out of his offices in Los Angeles. And Harlan was the last county before the road turned north toward Lexington and the long drive back to whatever came next. He was traveling without a crew, without the people who usually surrounded him, with only a driver, a man named Calhoun, quiet, former Army. And he had asked Calhoun to take the back roads because he had not been in this country since before the war, and he wanted to see what it looked like now. What it looked like in the first week of January 1955 was the way it always looked in January, stripped and gray, the ridges bare, the creek bottoms mud dark, smoke from coal stoves rising straight in the cold air because there was no wind. It was a landscape that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Wayne had grown up in a different kind of hard country, the California desert, the Iowa flatlands of his childhood, but he recognized something in this land that he could not have easily named, the look of a place that had given a great deal and was still being asked for more. He was 50 years old that year. Not old. Not for a man his size and his particular constitution, but past the point where he could spend a January night in a car without feeling it the next morning. He had checked into the Harlan Hotel, a modest place on a main street called the Cumberland Arms, for stories of brick built in the 1920s. On the evening of January 5th, and he had asked the desk clerk for a quiet room away from the street and gone upstairs without stopping in the lobby. He was recognizable. He was always recognizable. The height, the shoulders, the jaw, the way he filled the doorway. But he had learned over many years how to move through public space with a velocity that made stopping feel like an interruption of something already in progress. Most people let him pass. He had a past with this part of the world in the most general sense. He had played men from places like this, men who worked with their hands and lived by codes that the land enforced. Whether that gave him any particular understanding of Harlan County in January 1955 was not something he dwelled on. He was a working man in his fashion. He understood debt and hard seasons and the specific weight of a thing that might be lost. He had come down for breakfast at Tatum's at 6 in the morning on January 6th, before most of the town was moving, and he had sat in a corner booth with coffee and eggs and the Harlan Daily Enterprise and read about a school board meeting and a mine safety inspection and a weather forecast that promised more cold with possible snow by the weekend. The diner had 4 other customers at that hour, all of them men coming off or going to shift work, and the woman who brought his coffee had looked at him for 2 seconds longer than she looked at anyone else, then gone back to the counter without comment. He appreciated this. It was at Tatum's on the morning of January 7th, his second morning, the day he had planned to have Calhoun bring the car around and start north, that he overheard the conversation that changed his plans. He was in the same corner booth. The diner had filled somewhat by 7:30, and 2 men had taken the booth directly across the narrow aisle. They were not speaking quietly, in the way of men who feel they are among their own kind in a familiar place. One of them, a man in a flannel shirt and canvas work jacket, was telling the other about a woman he knew. He called her Clara, then Clara Hodge, who was about to lose her place on the Baxter Road. He said the bank had a deadline. He said the deadline had either passed or was about to. He said it was a shame because she was a good woman whose husband had died of a broken heart, more or less, and the bank was not going to get more than pennies on the dollar by selling the place in January, and everyone knew it, but no one at the bank seemed to care. The other man made a sound of agreement and said that was how banks were, and what could you do? Wayne paid attention to the rest of the conversation the way he paid attention to things, without moving, without appearing to listen, his eyes on the newspaper. He heard the full account, or as much of it as the man in the flannel shirt knew to tell. The dead husband, the 3 children, the 40 acres on the Baxter Road, the arrearage, the deadline. He heard the figure, $400 and some odd. He did not ask any questions during the conversation. He waited until both men had paid and left, and then he asked the woman who had brought his coffee. Her name was Lena. It was stitched on her apron, whether she knew the Hodge family on the Baxter Road. Lena said she did. She went to the same church as Clara, First Baptist, and Clara was a fine woman. He asked Lena if she knew what the number was, the specific number the bank was looking for. Lena said she had heard $416. He asked whether anyone had helped. Lena said she reckoned people would have if they had it to give, but January was a hard month, and most people on the road out that way were in their own tight spots. Wayne thanked her and asked for more coffee. He sat with it for 20 minutes, looking at nothing in particular. Then he paid his check. The meal was $1.15, and he left $2 on the table. And he went back to the Cumberland Arms and asked the desk clerk for the location of the Harlan National Bank and what time it opened. The bank opened at 8:30. It was 8:15. He told Calhoun he needed another hour and walked the 2 blocks himself. Aldous Fitch was at his desk by 8:20, reviewing the day's correspondence, when one of the tellers came to his office door and said there was a man asking to speak with him about the Hodge account on the Baxter Road. Fitch looked up. The teller, a young man named Garrard, who had been at the bank 14 months, looked slightly unsettled. Fitch asked him to send the man in. John Wayne came through the doorway of Aldous Fitch's office the way he came through most doorways, slowly, deliberately, with a kind of unhurried authority that was not performed but simply present. He was in a heavy canvas coat over his cavalry shirt, no hat in the building, his dark hair graying at the temples, his jaw carrying 2 days of stubble. He was a large man in a small office, and he did not make anything of either fact. He sat in the chair across from Fitch's desk without being invited to sit, which he did without aggression, as a man sits when he has decided the conversation is going to take long enough to warrant it. Fitch said good morning and asked how he could help. Wayne said he understood the bank had an account in arrears on a property belonging to a widow named Clara Hodge on the Baxter Road, and that there was a deadline either at or recently passed, and that the amount outstanding was $416. Fitch looked at him. He recognized him. Everyone recognized him. He said that account information was confidential. Wayne said he understood that, and that he was not asking Fitch to confirm anything private. He said he was going to do something, and he wanted to make sure he was doing it right, and that if the figure was $416, he would like to settle it now, this morning, before any paperwork was filed. Fitch said the deadline had been January 3rd. It was now January 7th. The foreclosure paperwork had been prepared, but not yet filed with the county clerk. He said this carefully, because it was true, and because the man across his desk was someone whose name he would be saying for the rest of his life no matter what happened in the next 10 minutes, and he wanted to be accurate. Wayne said, "What would it take to close this account properly, arrearage and remaining balance together, and remove the lien from the property today?" Fitch opened the account ledger. The remaining principal on the improvement loan was $622. The arrearage was $416. Together, paid in full, the account would close for $1,038. Wayne reached into the interior pocket of his canvas coat and produced a leather wallet of the kind that folded flat. He counted out 11 $100 bills onto the surface of Fitch's desk. He counted them slowly, each one placed flat and squared, and when he reached the 11th, he put the wallet back in his pocket and said that was $1,100 and he would take the change and a receipt. Nobody moved in that room for a moment. Fitch was looking at the money. He had handled larger transactions in his years at the bank, but there was something about the physical fact of $1,100 bills placed on his desk at 8:30 in the morning by a man he had seen on a movie screen that made the room feel differently proportioned than it usually did. He recovered himself. He was a professional. He reached for his ledger. He wrote up the payoff calculation by hand. Principal, $622. Arrearage, $416. Total, $1,038. He counted back $62 from the 1100 in two 20s and a 10 and two ones and two dimes and placed it on the desk beside the ledger. He wrote out a receipt on bank stationery, handwritten because the typed forms were for scheduled closings and this was not a scheduled anything. He wrote the account number and the property description and the amount received and the date, and he signed it and stamped it with the bank's notary seal because the seal was in his desk drawer and it seemed like the right thing to do. Then he wrote out a separate letter, one page, on the bank's letterhead, stating that the improvement loan on the property described in Deed Book 47, page 218, Harlan County Records, had been paid in full as of January 7th, 1955, that no lien or encumbrance remain on behalf of the Harlan National Bank, and that the property was free and clear of any claim arising from this account. He signed it. He stamped it with the notary seal. He wrote the date. He did this because it was the correct instrument and because he would tell his wife that evening it felt like the kind of thing that needed to be done right. Wayne folded the receipt and the letter together and put them in his coat pocket. He picked up the $62 and put it in the exterior pocket of his coat. He stood and extended his hand across the desk, and Fitch shook it. Wayne said he appreciated the efficiency. Fitch said it had been. And then he stopped because what it had been was not something he had a word for in his professional vocabulary, and he did not want to say something that sounded foolish. He said he hoped Mrs. Hodge would be all right. Wayne said he expected she would be and walked out. Gerard, the young teller, was standing near the front counter when Wayne came through the lobby. He had heard enough through the thin office walls to understand that something unusual had happened, though not the full shape of it. He watched Wayne cross the lobby and push through the front door, and he stood there for a moment after the door swung closed, looking at the space where the man had been. Wayne walked back to the Cumberland Arms. He told Calhoun to bring the car around in 40 minutes. He went upstairs to his room, picked up his traveling bag, and looked out the window at the main street of Harlan, Kentucky, at the hardware store and the diner and the courthouse with its bare January trees. He stood there for a moment. Then he went back downstairs. He asked the desk clerk if there was a way to get out to the Baxter Road without going through the center of town. The clerk said you could take the Old Mill Road south and come up on the Baxter Road from the lower end, which would take maybe 10 minutes longer, but it was paved the whole way. Wayne thanked him. He told Calhoun to take the Mill Road. The Hodge property on the Baxter Road was visible from the road in January in a way it was not in summer. The fence line clear against the brown grass, the white house set back 100 yards, smoke from the chimney, the hay barn to the east. Wayne had Calhoun pull over on the shoulder of the road across from the fence, and he sat in the car for a moment, looking at the place. He could see the house was occupied, could see the light in the kitchen window, could see what he thought might be the shape of a woman moving behind the glass. He told Calhoun to wait. He got out of the car. He went to the trunk, which held his bag and a few other items from the week's travel. He opened it and stood for a moment, looking at his coat. Not the canvas coat he was wearing, but the other one, a heavy wool coat, dark brown, military cut, something he had owned for many years, and that was warm in a serious way. He had brought it along because the week had looked cold on the forecast, and he had not worn it since the first day because the canvas coat had been sufficient. He took it out of the trunk. He felt the weight of it. Good weight. The weight of something that would hold against this kind of cold for hours. He walked to the fence. The locust posts were solid, the wire sound between them. He found the post nearest the road, where the wire was tightest, and he draped the coat over the post and the top wire, smoothing it so it sat flat and would not blow off easily. It was a cold morning, 9 degrees at the hotel thermometer when he had left, maybe 10 now, and the coat settled into position with the particular rigidity of heavy wool in hard cold. He stood there for a moment and looked at the house. The light was still in the kitchen window. He walked back to the car. He told Calhoun to go. Calhoun asked which way, and Wayne said north, toward Lexington, the main road. Calhoun pulled out onto the Baxter Road and headed north, and the Hodge property fell behind them, and Wayne did not look back at it. Clara Hodge saw the coat at 9:20 that morning. She had been in the kitchen since 6, the children up and fed, and Ruth and Thomas off to school, and Patsy at the kitchen table with her drawings, and she had been working through what she intended to do that day, which was go to the bank and tell Aldous Fitch that she was working on the money and ask for a specific extension in days, not months, because she had reason to believe she could raise another $40 or $50 by the end of the week if the restaurant in town agreed to a larger, butter order. She had planned what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, and she was not hopeful, but she was not finished either, and being not finished was the only mode she had available. She had gone out to the barn at 9 to check on the remaining dairy cows. There were 3 now, since the sale, and she came back through the front yard rather than the side door because she wanted to look at the fence post that had healed over and see whether the ground was frozen hard enough yet to reset it or whether she would need to wait. She came around the corner of the house, and she saw it on the fence post by the road. She stopped walking. She stood in the yard looking at it for a moment because her first thought was that something had blown up from the road and caught on the wire. A tarp, maybe from a passing truck. But it was too deliberate for that. It was draped flat and squared, not tangled. It was a coat. She went to the fence and lifted it off the post. It was heavy, heavier than anything she owned, heavier than Robert's winter coat had been. Good wool, tightly woven, dark brown, military cut. Not new, but well kept. She turned it over in her hands. There was nothing in the pockets. She checked all of them. No note, no name. The lining had a small maker's label from a clothier in Los Angeles, California, and that was all. She looked both ways on the Baxter Road. There was no car. There was no one on the road at all. There were tire tracks in the frozen mud at the shoulder. Fresh ones, she thought, though she was not certain, where someone might have pulled over. But there was nothing else. Just the cold air and the bare ridge and the smoke from her own chimney and the coat in her hands. She carried it inside. She hung it on the hook by the front door, where Robert's coat had hung. She stood looking at it for a moment and then went back to the kitchen. Patsy looked up from her drawing and asked what that was, and Clara said she wasn't sure. Someone must have left it, and Patsy looked at it with the frank curiosity of a 9-year-old and then went back to her horses. Clara put on her church coat and got her pocketbook and drove the 3 miles into Harlan in the farm truck because she had decided she was going to the bank regardless, and she was going to say what she had to say. She parked on a main street and went in and asked to see Mr. Fitch. The receptionist, a woman named Blevins, said of course and went to knock on his door. She sat across from Fitch with her hands folded, and she began the speech she had prepared. She said she knew the deadline had passed, and she knew she was short, and she wanted to know specifically how many days she had before the paperwork was filed. Fitch looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not immediately understand. He was not cold, exactly, but he was measuring something, deciding something. Then he opened his desk drawer and produced 2 pieces of paper, folded together, and placed them on the desk in front of her. She unfolded them. She read them. She read the receipt first, with the account number and the amount and the date and the words paid in full. She read the letter second, with the language about the lien being discharged and the property being free and clear. She read both of them twice, because the first time she read them, she did not fully take in what they said. She looked up at Fitch. She asked him who had done this. Fitch said a man had come in that morning and settled the account in full. He said he was not able to provide the man's name. Clara said that was not. And then she stopped because she was about to say that was not possible, and she could see that it was, in fact, possible because the papers were in her hands. She asked Fitch if he could tell her anything at all. Fitch said the man had been in early and had left before 9 and had asked that no particular attention be called to the transaction. He said that was all he was in a position to say. Clara sat with the papers in her hands for another few seconds. Fitch noticed that she did not cry. She was very still, and her face did something complicated. Not collapse, not relief exactly, but something that seemed to pass through her features like a change in weather, here and then gone, replaced by the same composed expression she had come in with. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Fitch." She said she appreciated how he had handled things. Fitch said he was sorry for the delay, which was the most he could offer, and she accepted it. She drove home on the Baxter Road. She did not know who had done it. She thought about it for the entire 3 miles, and she could not make it resolve into anyone she knew or anyone she had any claim on. Robert's people did not have that kind of money on a January morning. Her own family did not. The church could not raise $400 in a week, and she had not asked them to try. She thought of Dewey Hodge in his salvage yard and dismissed the idea. She thought of the Ridgeline Diner and dismissed that too. There was no one. She pulled into the yard and sat in the truck for a moment. Then she went inside. She stood at the front door and looked at the coat on the hook. She never found out who put it there. She asked, quietly, over the following weeks. She asked Lena at the diner, who looked at her with an expression that might have been knowledge or might have been sympathy, and said she couldn't say for certain. She asked the desk clerk at the Cumberland Arms. She had heard that a man had been staying there around that time. She did not know how she heard this. Maybe Ruth had heard at school, and the clerk said they had a number of guests that week, and he couldn't speak to anyone's comings and goings. She asked Fitch one more time in February when she came in to make her regular payment. On time now, restored, beginning again. And Fitch said only what he had said before, that the man had asked for discretion. Clara accepted this. She was not passive by nature, but she understood that some things were given without wanting anything in return, and that pressing on them too hard was its own kind of ingratitude. She kept the papers, the receipt, and the letter in the kitchen drawer where Robert's payment book had been. She kept them in a manila envelope she labeled simply January 7th, 1955 in her clear, arithmetic student handwriting. She kept the coat on the hook by the front door. That winter was cold through February and eased in March. Clara made her March payment on the 1st and her April payment 4 days early. By the time the garden came in, she had rebuilt the savings account to $140. She fixed the fence post that had heeled over. She and Thomas together on a Saturday in April, the ground soft enough to work. Thomas was good with post-hole diggers, better than she had expected, and he worked without being told twice what to do, which Clara thought was something Robert would have noticed. By the following January, a year after the coat appeared on the fence post, the savings account held $380. The cattle herd was back to 11 head, she having bought 2 young animals in the summer at a good price. The timber on the back 12 acres had appreciated in value as the market firmed slightly, and a man from Pineville had offered her a selective harvest arrangement that would net her $400 and some over the fall season without stripping the stand. She took the offer. She put the money in the account. Ruth finished high school in the spring of 1955 and took a job as a clerk at the county court clerk's office, which paid $23 a week and covered her own expenses and left her able to put $12 a month into her mother's household account without anyone being asked to make a point of it. Thomas, the following year, finished his own high school and was admitted to the University of Kentucky in Lexington on a partial scholarship, agriculture and economics, which suited him exactly, and went north on a Greyhound bus with a single bag and his father's watch. He sent money home when he could. Patsy kept drawing horses. The farm on the Baxter Road stood. It did what Clara had always intended it to do. It produced. It sheltered. It persisted. Clara herself worked the farm and the diner. She moved from the Ridgeline to Tatum's proper in 1956, where the pay was better and the hours were steadier. And she paid the improvement loan down to zero in the summer of 1959, for years ahead of the original schedule. She walked into the Harlan National Bank on the morning of July 12, 1959, and made the final payment, $38.19, and received from Aldous Fitch, who was now the bank manager, the paid-in full stamp on her loan document. Fitch shook her hand. She thanked him and left. She stopped on the sidewalk outside and stood in the July heat for a moment, looking up and down the main street of Harlan. Then she walked to her truck. She thought, as she sometimes did at moments like that one, about the morning in January 4 years ago. She had thought about it periodically ever since, not obsessively, but the way you think about something that does not resolve, something you cannot explain, and have made a kind of peace with not explaining. She had long since concluded that whoever had done it had been a person of means passing through, someone who had heard of her situation and acted on it, and that she would never know who. The coat, the papers, the $62 she had found in the envelope the coat left behind. She had found that later in the inside pocket, which she had not checked the first time. $62 and 2 20s and a 10 and 2 1s and 2 dimes, tucked in the inner pocket where she had not thought to look. She had sat at the kitchen table with the money in front of her, and she had taken a breath that was longer than her usual breathing, and then she had put the money in the envelope and put the envelope in the drawer. The coat itself, she wore that winter when the canvas coat she owned was not sufficient. It fit her oddly. It was made for a much larger frame, but it was warm in the way that could not be argued with. She wore it to the barn on the worst mornings, draped around her shoulders, and she wore it to look at the fence on Saturdays when the cold was serious. Ruth had asked once again whose it was, and Clara had said someone left it. Ruth, at 17, had understood from her mother's tone that this was the complete answer. In 1991, 36 years after that January morning, Clara Hodges' youngest daughter, Patsy, who had grown up to be Patsy Hodge Combs, married to a Harlan County man, mother of 3, living in a house 10 miles up the road from the Baxter property, was cleaning out the farmhouse in preparation for a sale. Clara had died the previous spring at 74 in the same bedroom where Robert had died, which was not a sad fact, but a true one, and the house was going to a young couple from the county who wanted land for a horse operation. Patsy had been going through the house room by room, sorting 40 years of accumulation into boxes when she found the kitchen drawer. The drawer held the payment book, Robert's handwriting in it, and then Clara's. It held a small leather Bible, Clara's name written in it in someone else's hand. And it held the manila envelope labeled January 7th, 1955. Patsy sat at the kitchen table with the envelope and opened it. She found a receipt and a letter from the Harlan National Bank. Aldous Fitch's signature on both, the notary stamp faded but legible. She found a record of the payoff, $1,038, paid in full, January 7th, 1955. She sat with the paper for a long time, reading the language carefully. She had heard the story in the way you hear a family story, loosely, incompletely, as background fact rather than examined history. A man had come through. Someone had paid the mortgage. Her mother had never found out who. She looked at the letter again. The payoff amount was precise. The date was precise. There was no name on any of it except Aldous Fitch's. She found the coat later that afternoon, in the hall closet, where it had lived for 36 years behind other coats and rain gear and the Christmas decorations. Dark brown wool, military cut, the maker's label from a Los Angeles clothier. She lifted it off its hook and held it in front of her and looked at it for a moment, then put it over her arm. She carried it to the truck. She kept the coat, and she kept the envelope. Both of them went into the Combs house 10 miles up the road. The coat went on a hook in the back hallway, where her own children would sometimes ask about it, and Patsy would say it belonged to someone who helped your grandmother a long time ago, and that was usually enough for a child, which meant it was stored in a way that would allow the question to be asked again when they were older. The envelope, and the papers inside it, she put in a cedar box on the shelf in her bedroom, where she kept the things that mattered most. She had a photograph of her parents on their wedding day in there, and a letter Thomas had written home from Lexington in his first year of college, and her father's watch, which Thomas had sent back when he got a new one, and now the manila envelope with its clear arithmetic student handwriting. By the time Patsy's own children were grown and asking real questions, this was the late 1990s, this was the internet age, this was a time when you could look things up. One of them, a daughter named Clara, named for her grandmother, found a photograph in a book about classic westerns. A photograph of a man in a dark wool coat, military cut, standing beside a horse on a film set somewhere in Arizona or Utah. The coat familiar in the particular way that a thing is familiar when you have grown up seeing its twin in your own house. She brought the book to Patsy. She showed her the photograph. She said, "Is that the coat?" Patsy looked at it for a long time. She said she couldn't say for certain, but she kept the book. She put it in the cedar box beside the envelope. And the coat stayed on the hook in the back hallway of the Combs house. And the winters kept coming, and the ridges of Harlan County kept wearing their particular January gray, and the Baxter Road ran on from the courthouse toward the old Hodge property, as it always had, through country that had given a great deal and been asked for more. And on one January morning 36 years and a lifetime ago, a large man in a canvas coat had pulled over on the shoulder of that road and gotten out of a car and draped a heavy wool coat over a locust post fence and walked back and gotten into the car and told the driver to go north and had not looked back, and the cold had held the coat in place until a woman came around the corner of her white frame house at 9:20 in the morning and saw it and stopped. She never knew who put it there. That was how he left it. And it was the only way it could have worked, the kind of good that requires no name attached to it, that belongs entirely to the person who receives it, that is not diminished by time or explanation or the long, slow work of figuring out what it cost. A man had paid $1,038 and driven north out of Harlan County in January of 1955, and the farm on the Baxter Road had stood, and the family on the Baxter Road had stood, and a coat on a fence post on a cold Kentucky morning had kept something warm that had every reason to go cold. Some debts are paid by people who are owed nothing, and those are the only ones that fully settle.